All right, rewind this scene. Or fast forward because this happens later. And Theoden never gives this speech in the book. And for what is probably my favorite scene all time in the movies, and one that I never cease to shed a tear when I rewatch it, is actually a lot more powerful in the book, given the context of who actually gives the speech and why they give it and when they give it. And I think it's just such an interesting commentary for J.R.R. Tolkien on the acceptance of death in a really dark moment in this character's life. So before I proceed, I do want to issue a warning on this video to anyone that's watching. This essay will cover the idea of death, and while I don't really think this is what this character is dealing with, and I will talk about this in a bit, a potential suicidal charge that this man is leading. I've been putting off writing this essay for like a week. I don't fully know why, to be honest, and I think it's just like a hard one to talk about and write about. But I also think I'm putting this one off because it seems to be one of the realest scenes in the entire book, especially because it's a character confronting death and realizing its full weight. And sometimes that scares me, the idea of confronting death and really realizing its full weight and changing your life because of it. And I've talked about this before in other essays with Eomer specifically, and with the Fae that falls on certain characters, and with Frodo. But this is really like an Eomer-centric chapter here. He is the one that takes center stage. And this is the guy who is essentially saying the death chant and leading the Rohirrim out into battle. But when I talk about this, I want to talk about a few other aspects of literature that I think people have stolen from Tolkien, and specifically this chapter as well. And really specifically for what it means for a character to really endure death and why they're enduring it. It's just a nuanced video. So the first time we actually see Eomer in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is after Theoden has been taken down by his horse, and after Eowyn, his sister, has revealed her identity and destroyed the Witch King. So this is the moment that happens right after, and this is what the book says. He closed his eyes, and Merry bowed beside him. Presently he spoke again. Where is Eomer? For my eyes darken, and I would see him ere I go. He must be king after me, and I would send word to Eowyn. She would not have me leave her, and now I shall not see her again, dearer than daughter. Now, other than the fact that this is actually tragic that Theoden is dying feet away from Eowyn and finally calls her his daughter, there's a really devastating part in the chapter before this as well, that Theoden for the first time in the book calls Eomer his son. Usually he says sister son or something like that, but this moment he actually calls him, when he's yelling out battle plans, he yells, Eomer, my son. Now, Theoden has been a father to Eowyn and Eomer for, I think, a lot of his life, the majority of both of their lives. And I did some light research on this video, not too much to spoil anything that happens in the appendices or the Silmarillion or anything, but I did found that Eomer and Eowyn's father, Eamund, died at the hands of orcs. And what is even more tragic is that his mother died shortly thereafter because of grief. Now, that fact really informs me of the actions of Eomer, because maybe it's somewhat hereditary, this emotion. I know certain families can sometimes feel a bit more stolid than others, but Eomer's mother's dying of grief is something that I want to talk about more when I actually read it on the page myself, because I'm sure that there's more to it, and it's simultaneously romantic and also really frustrating at the same time. She was still a mother when her husband died, and Eomer and Eowyn needed her. But I'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. And Theoden, really being one of the manliest men in the whole book, takes on the responsibility of raising his niece and nephew in this section. Theoden's own son, Theodred, dies as well, and he is still in the midst of that grief when he calls Eomer his son. I actually find that really admirable on Theoden's part. I love that. And so now we come to the section where Eomer kind of loses it in the book. This is what the book says. For a moment the thought flitted through Merry's mind. Where is Gandalf? Is he not here? Could he not have saved the king and Eowyn? But thereupon Eomer rode up in haste, and with him came the knights of the household that still lived and had now mastered their horses. They looked in wonder at the carcass of the fell beast that lay there, and their steeds would not go near. But Eomer leapt from the saddle, and grief and dismay fell upon him as he came to the king's side and stood there in silence. For all the issues with the Harry Potter movies that I have, I think one of the scenes that I quietly love and think is the best one is when Cedric comes back from the Triwizard Tournament with Harry and Amos Diggory mourns over his body. It is one of the most powerful scenes in all of the movies. And I kind of view this scene in the same way, but even more chaotic and emotional because we are in the literal midst of a war and a battle right now. There are orcs all around fighting the men of Rohan and Gondor. And Eomer rushes over and sees his uncle, really his father, lying nearly dead. And he loses it. I can imagine in my head that everyone is quiet as this is happening. It's a moment that's almost too holy and too sacred for a battlefield. A moment that I'm sure all of them think they're kind of intruding on. And I find something so beautiful about Eomer doing this in the middle of battle. Because men tend to struggle to show emotions at times. I don't think that's like that's a general statement. I don't think it's, it's case by case, but I think there's a perception of weakness that feels attached to it. The perception that a partner will find us maybe less attractive if we show any signs of vulnerability like this. But there are moments when it just kind of comes out whether we know it or not. And Eomer has this moment right here. He is respected by all his soldiers. And there were moments early on when we first met him in the early chapters when we kind of see like insubordination happening with Eomer and his men. They seem like they respect him, but like not to the point of they respecting Theoden. He seems to be a good, tough character, but his men are a little tougher to lead. And one of the things I loved most about Eomer was actually his ability to change his mind. When he talked about Galadriel and spoke of her badly and Gimli wanted to sort him out, Eomer said essentially that he'd be glad to learn and think better of her. And I think in this moment, if I'm a soldier of Rohan right now, and I see Eomer leap off his horse and weep for the king/uncle/father that he just lost, I would silently watch, probably avert my eyes and bow my head in reverence for this man. And this is a weird headcanon, but I now have a headcanon about this that I kind of believe there was an orc there who was fighting, and when he heard the grief of Eomer, just kind of paused as well and bowed his head in honor of this man who was grieving. Maybe, that's a sacrilegious headcanon, but that is a moment that is so powerful to me. It's a moment that I think I'm just like sitting here. If I'm sitting in this moment, I'm just thinking about everything that's happened in Eomer's life. I'm overcome with grief by this fact. I would think to myself, why and what else that has to happen to this man that he has to endure through these things? And it's a moment where, again, I think two things are going on in my mind, where I respect him and I now understand that he's going to be a great leader. And I don't know why, but people who have dealt with great loss to me are more trustworthy, and they can be better leaders as far as I'm concerned. If you know what it's like to feel your heart ripped out and you feel cold and like, the warmth will never come again, and you know what that feeling is like when you don't know if you'll ever smile or be able to laugh again, weirdly, I think you'll be a good leader because that gives you a great deal of empathy with other people who experience that. And I think Eomer, while Eomer kind of always had that in my opinion, this is the moment when I think a lot of his men might have seen that. Because what was in the previous chapters a bit of insubordination from his men now seems to have become full-on respect. I also think what comes next is brutal too, because he has already endured so much, and now as a soldier he looks next to his uncle and sees Eowyn lying on the field of battle. And it's just too much. But before I read this is the rest of the Theoden story, and it's, again, equally as devastating. It says, "Then one of the knights took the king's banner from the hand of Guthlaf, the banner bearer who lay dead, and he lifted it up. Slowly Theoden opened his eyes. Seeing the banner, he made a sign that it should be given to Eomer. 'Hail, King of the Mark,' he said. 'Ride now to victory. Bid Eowyn farewell.' And so he died, and knew not that Eowyn lay near him. And those who stood by wept, crying, 'Theoden King, Theoden King.' But Eomer said to them, 'Mourn not overmuch. Mighty was the fallen, meet was his ending. When his mound is raised, women then shall weep. War now calls us.' Yet he himself wept as he spoke. 'Let his knights remain here,' he said, 'and bear his body in honor from the field, lest the battle ride over it. Yea, and all these other of the king's men that lie here. and he looked at the slain, recalling their names. Now, Eomer puts his grief aside for a moment here because he's doing something that Denethor cannot do. He is doing what he must do and what must be done for the good of others rather than himself. This is something that I actually really love about Eomer. If he were to act like Denethor right now, he would probably skirt all responsibilities and immediately go into Minas Tirith and potentially burn himself with Theoden and Eowyn, alive. But he tells them to not mourn much because there's still battle to be fought. And while he is still weeping, he's looking over those that rode with the king, and this is what the book says. Then suddenly he beheld his sister Eowyn as she lay, and he knew her. He stood for a moment as a man who is pierced in the midst of a cry by an arrow through the heart. And then his face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him so that all speech failed him for a while. A fey mood took him. Eowyn, Eowyn, he cried at last. Eowyn, how come you here? What madness or devilry is this? Death, 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 death take us all. Then, without taking counsel or waiting for the approach of the men of the city, he spurred headlong back to the front of the great host, and blew a horn, and cried aloud for the onset. Over the field rang his clear voice, calling, Death, ride to ruin, and the world's ending. And with that, the host began to move. But the Rohirrim sang no more. Death, they cried with one voice loud and terrible. And gathering speed like a great tide, their battles swept about their fallen king and passed, roaring away southward. Now, if you've been watching any of my videos over the last few months, you know my favorite word in Tolkien now is fey. Because I think I've been thinking about this one for a really long time and trying to find a good word to describe in this that are talking about I've seen a lot of movies and shows, and I've lacked a word for this. And Tolkien already found one a few decades ago. And so fey, as Merriam-Webster defines it, is this idea of being doomed, marked by a foreboding of death or calamity, which is a great definition. Now, one of my favorite podcasts is Binge Mode. And the two hosts in that show talk about this idea all the time in literature as people who seem to have a distinct aura and mood about them. Now, two characters that they think kind of have this idea of fey are Neville Longbottom, which not really, they've talked about that a little bit, but more so Jon Snow. Now, they perceive Jon Snow as being a bit more suicidal than anything else, which I really haven't read the books, but I will soon give all my thoughts on that as I read it. But in this show, I wouldn't know if I don't think that I would say that he is in a fey mood in those instances. Potentially, but he's more, I don't know. I think he's just more grumpy sometimes. And I think in the famous scene, the Battle of the Bastards, when he draws his sword ready to accept death, it's less of a suicidal idea and much more of someone who knows death is right around the corner and just accepts it and accepts the fight anyway. And it's understandable for Eomer to be going through this, but when he sees Theoden and his body lying there, he's ready to fight responsibly, and he's ready to lead his men well. When he sees the death of his sister, he loses it. And the book even talks about that a bit. His fury actually betrays him. This is what the book says. Not too soon came their aid to the Rohirrim, for fortune had turned against Eomer, and his fury had betrayed him. The great wrath of his onset had utterly overthrown the front of his enemies, and the great wedges of his riders had passed clear through the ranks of the Southrons, discomfiting their horsemen, and riding their footmen to ruin. But wherever the Mumakil came, their horses would not go, but blenched and swerved away. And the great monsters were unfought and stood like towers of defense, and the Haradrim rallied about them. So he's making a rash move here, and his men are kind of still following him because he's just an inspiring presence, but Eomer is ruled by fury here. And again, it's understandable. I think I would be in the same place if I just saw two people that I love die like that. And Eomer has nothing left to live for, just to be completely honest. Well, he does actually have a lot to live for, but in this moment, he seems and he feels like he's lost everything that he holds dear. His mother, his father, his cousin, which was someone likely that he grew up with, in a lot of happiness. And I'm sure that Eomer wasn't really that happy to ascend the throne after Theodred's death, because I'm sure that he knew Theodred was going to ascend the throne and he didn't have to worry about that much. And now he's lost his father figure, which is his uncle, and his sister. What kin does he have left? Why fight with any reservation of death or of losing your life? This is something that I'm kind of reminded a bit in the scene in The Dark Knight Rises when he's in that prison, in that pit, and he attempts to keep doing this jump with this rope on to try to escape, but the man says that he needs to try it without the rope because a fear of death is a great motivator. But I actually almost think this is something different from what Eomer is experiencing. That it's a rarity to see this moment in literature, but sadly not a rarity to see it in the work of Tolkien. I guess World War I probably does that to you, but it's the idea of fighting and fearing death. But then his characters seem to come to realize that they will die anyway, so they go charging without any reservation, abandoning fear. There's a beauty to it, but there's also a terrible sadness as well. Eomer doesn't fear death. He almost welcomes it in this moment. He has seen it on the battlefield take the people that he loves. And so he is much more apt to not be motivated by his fear of death, but by his acceptance and laughter in the face of it. And I think it's as if he's challenging death in this moment. It's like he's saying, you think you can take something else from me? You've taken everything. Do your worst. But it's not nihilism. And I might be flirting with that idea a little too much, but I perceive this a lot more as defiance rather than nihilism. But it's a defiance of a different kind. Again, it's kind of hard to explain my thoughts on this because it's just kind of all over the place right now. But I think of the poem Rage Against the Dying of the Light, and I think that has an application here in what Eomer is not feeling. He's not raging against the dying of the light. He's challenging the power of darkness itself. It's a rare moment when a character stands on the edge of life and death and seems to master both of them. I kind of think of Harry at the end of the series, in one of her best written chapters in the forest again, and how Harry just deals with the idea of his death. And it slowly dawns on him what he must do. And so he marches out to meet it nonetheless. And he is doing this for love, but his love is for those to keep those people alive who are still there. Eomer is doing this perhaps with a bit more fury and reckless abandon, but he's doing it almost to keep the memory of those he loves alive. I feel this deep in my soul that in this moment he is showing defiance in the face of death. The death that Eomer is really going through. And it's the same idea that I was kind of talking about earlier this week, in that Eomer is confronting his grief here. He cannot cope with life at this moment. And it's an apt metaphor for how we should kind of experience terrible things. We just have to keep riding and defying death to its face. And in Eomer's potential last moment, when he sees the Corsairs of Umbar approaching, that he thinks surely spells the end and surely spells his doom. This is what the book says. The Rohirrim indeed had no need of news or alarm. All too well, they could see for themselves the black sails, for Eomer was now scarcely a mile from the Harland, and a great press of his first foes was between him and the haven there, while new foes came swirling behind, cutting him off from the prince. Now he looked to the river, and hope died in his heart. And side note, this is why I actually don't think he's dealing with nihilism. He had hope that he could still win and still stand in the end, or at least that his men could. That does not sound like nihilism to me. And book keeps going. And the wind that he had blessed he now called accursed. But the host of Mordor were enheartened, and filled with a new lust and fury, they came yelling to the onset. Stern now was Eomer's mood, and his mind clear again, which is interesting that his fury seems to subside here, and he's kind of just able to think a bit clearer. He let blow the horns to rally all men to his banner that could come thither, for he thought to make a great shield wall at the last, and stand, and fight there on foot till all fell, and do deeds of songs on the fields of Pelennor, though no man should be left in the west to remember the last king of the Mark. So he rode to a green hillock, and there sent his banner. And the white horse ran rippling in the wind. Out of doubt, out of darkness to the day's rising, I came singing into the sun, sword unsheathing. To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red nightfall. These staves he spoke, yet he laughed as he said them, for once more the lust of battle was on him, and he was still unscathed, and he was young, and he was king, a lord of a fell people. And lo, even as he laughed at despair, he looked out again on the black ships and lifted up his sword to defy them. And then wonder took him, and a great joy. And he cast his sword up in the sunlight and sang as he caught it. And all eyes followed his gaze, and behold, upon the foremost ship a great standard broke, and the wind displayed it as she turned toward the Harland. There flowered a white tree, and that was for Gondor. But 7 stars were about it, and a high crown above it, and the signs of Elendil that no lord had borne for years beyond count. And the stars flamed in the sunlight, for they were wrought of gems by Arwen, daughter of Elrond. And the crown was bright in the morning, for it was wrought of mithril and gold. Thus came Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Elisar, Isildur's heir, out of the paths of the dead, borne upon a wind from the sea, to the kingdom of Gondor. And the mirth of Rohan was a torrent of laughter and flashing of swords, and the joy and wonder of the city was a music of trumpets and ringing of bells. But the hosts of Mordor were seized with bewilderment, and a great wizardry it seemed to them that their own ship should be filled with their foes. And a black dread fell on them, knowing that the tides of fate had turned against them, and their doom was at hand. I just love that in his last moments, or really what he thinks are his last moments, that he is defying the enemy still. The Fey mood on him is really urging him forward. And in the end, what makes this scene so beautiful for me is that Eomer does not conquer death. He just simply rides with it. He cannot bring those he loves back from the dead. And so his cry of death is not really surrender, but it's not really a cry of despair also. It's acceptance. I think it's acceptance of something that we all kind of have to endure, but I think few face it with really open eyes. And again, one of the reasons why I think so few people have this in literature is because most people who write have never really experienced this. Tolkien seems like he has. And Eomer does not try to escape death here, nor does he try to collapse beneath the entire weight of death, as Denethor is doing at this moment. I think Eomer is looking at the bodies of his uncle and his sister, and he still rides. I imagine that when he's, giving his speech, and when he says the line, "To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking," that he quietly looks down the battlefield on where Theoden and Eowyn were lying. And as he does this, he becomes something I think greater than really a warrior or even a king. I think he becomes a symbol of what it means to live with loss, which is something that is difficult to write about. And this isn't glory. This isn't really some kind of cinematic moment of, he becomes the hero in this moment where the music might swell and the cameras pan across these cheering soldiers. I think this is a man who's just lost everything, who has no reason to go on, and yet he finds something sacred in the act of just continuing anyway and just continuing to go. That's not suicide. It's not nihilism. It's the kind of courage that only someone who has, I think, walked with death and not turned away can really understand. I think it's the courage to just keep riding, even when the light has gone out, simply because it's the right thing to do. Which is why I am so adamant, too, that Denethor is in the wrong here, and I do not like him as a character. Denethor is essentially abandoning the men in the face of his grief. Yes, he's grieving and he's going through something. But Eomer potentially does that when he rides out after he sees Eowyn, but it's much more out of defiance than anything else. And that's why I think this chapter is really, really one of Tolkien's best, most character-delving moments. It's not about the grandeur of kings or really this huge battle of armies going on. It's about one man's confrontation with grief and how he answers it. It's not with despair that he answers it, but with defiance and acceptance. When Eomer laughs in the face of despair and raises his sword toward what he thinks is his doom, it's the laughter of someone who has seen the worst that the world can do. And he still chooses the hope. Even though hope feels foolish, and when his heart gives up hope, he still hopes. That raising of the sword is his renewed hope. And in that moment, when the black sails turn to reveal the white tree, we see that hope is never foolish at all. So maybe that's what Tolkien is telling us here. That even when everything seems lost, when we are certain the ships on the horizon mean our end, there can still be something unexpected waiting for us in the wind. And I've kind of heard this term a lot in the comments and people talking about it all the time. Maybe Tolkien is trying to say to all of us that there might be some kind of eucatastrophe right around the bend. That the world's ending isn't always the world's ending. And I think this is honestly one of Tolkien's best chapters on how to deal with grief. I mean, I've read a lot of Tolkien because I've just literally been sitting and analyzing his work for a few months. And I think I've been looking for this specific answer for how a character encounters and deals with grief. And this just feels like that moment. And it's not just the idea of riding through grief. It's not just the idea of meeting it. It's just in everything that Eomer does. He is just totally and utterly confronted with grief in this moment. And I think his actions are a really, really great example of how you deal with it. Because everything is going wrong for him in this moment. And I think something that we need to hold on to and keep holding on to hope is this idea of a eucatastrophe. The idea that right around the bend, there might be something that changes our fortunes. And sometimes that's kept me holding on to hope. I'm a big hiker, and that's kept me holding on to hope in those moments when I'm exhausted and when I'm just looking right around the bend in a literal sense of the word for the next stop. But I think that's really true in life too. That we don't know what the next moment might hold. And so if you've made it through this video, despite some of my warnings, and you're struggling in life right now, I just want to offer that encouragement to be like Eomer, to ride forward in the face of death, not fearing it anymore. Ride forward in face of the defiance of death, that it can't do any harm to you anymore. And know that there might be something around the corner that changes the winds of what's going on. And it might be exactly the thing that you need. That idea of a eucatastrophe right around the bend. But that's all I got for today. I still am live processing through my thoughts on this. That was not the most clear and concise essay that I've ever done. But if you made it this far, make sure you subscribe. You can also like the video too, or become a member for some members only content. And as always, remember to look toward Numenor that was, and beyond to Elvenhome that is, and to that which is beyond Elvenhome and will ever be. I'll see you in the next one.